I remember the weekend clearly, even though it has stayed with me mostly as a weight of unease. I was 16, and my friends and I had convinced ourselves that camping deep in the Chuquamagon-Nicolet National Forest would be a perfect escape from parents and schedules. None of us had much experience beyond the occasional scout trip or backyard campout. We drove in just before dusk, the trees thickening as the narrow forest road wound deeper into the shadows. The air was damp, carrying the scent of wet pine and earth, and the sky had already begun to dull to a gray that felt permanent, like it had no intention of yielding to night or morning. We chose a clearing that appeared almost by accident, a flat patch bordered by low pines and a mist that seemed to rise off the ground in a way that made the trees ahead look half faded, half solid. By the time our tents were pitched, the sun had disappeared entirely, and the forest had a stillness that made every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sound louder than it should. We built a small fire, enough to push the chill back from our hands and faces. The smoke curled into the fog, dissipating slowly, but the mist didn't thin. It just hovered, covering the edges of the clearing in a white haze that made the forest feel endless. I was crouched by the fire, poking at the embers, when I noticed movement. It was subtle at first, a flicker in the mist at the far edge of the clearing. I squinted, trying to make it out. It was a boy small, probably 10 years old. His clothes clung to him, wet and dark, though I couldn't see any source for the water. His bare feet glistened in the dim light from our fire. He didn't step toward us, just stood there, staring, completely still. At first I thought he was lost, that he had wandered away from a trail or a nearby road. I called out, trying to be loud enough to make him hear, but soft enough not to startle him into running. The fog swallowed my voice, though, and it faded almost immediately. He didn't respond. He just stayed there, staring, his eyes focused somewhere beyond the firelight. I couldn't read his expression. It wasn't fear, it wasn't curiosity. It was the kind of blankness that makes your stomach tighten when you notice it on someone you don't know. Then he moved. The boy ran straight into the fog, the mist closing around him in a way that made him disappear almost instantly. There was no sound of feet on leaves or snapping twigs, just a disturbance of the air, as if he had been pulled into the mist itself. My friends saw it too, though none of us said anything. We all froze, looking at where he had been, waiting for some sign of him to reappear. But there was nothing. We stepped toward the edge of the clearing the next morning, trying to find some explanation. The mist had lifted, leaving a damp, gray morning behind it. The ground was soft, almost spongy underfoot, with patches of low ferns and moss. And there they were, footprints, small and bare, leading from the clearing straight into a patch of swamp that had no visible exit. The mud around it was thick, treacherous, and full of reeds and fallen branches. The prints ended abruptly in the wet, sucking soil. There was no continuation, no sign he had left the swamp. It was like he had simply vanished, leaving the forest to reclaim the marks he had made. We couldn't understand it. None of us had the experience to track someone through that terrain, but the ground itself told a story that didn't make sense. We argued quietly among ourselves, but there was no resolution. Every suggestion had holes. Maybe someone had pulled him out of the swamp, but there were no tracks besides the ones leading in. Maybe he had slipped, gotten stuck, or drowned, but there were no signs, no disturbance beyond the footprints. Every answer felt incomplete. The rest of the night and morning were spent moving cautiously through the surrounding forest, marking our path, trying to keep track of each other. We didn't make a fire that night. We didn't sleep in shifts. We just sat awake, alert to every sound. The forest was alive in ways we hadn't noticed during the day. An owl calling from deep in the pines, the distant murmur of water in a creek, the crack of branches from some unseen animal. Each sound set our nerves on edge. The boy, or the idea of him, loomed in every shadow. I kept returning to the footprints in my mind. The swamp seemed impossible. We had all stepped close enough to see the depth of the mud, how it clung to our boots and threatened to suck us in. The boy's prints ended neatly in the middle of it. The forest hadn't swallowed him physically, but somehow it had. And the realization settled in a quiet, creeping way. The forest can make you disappear without explanation, without a trace. You can be standing there, soaked and shivering, with nothing around you except mist and the smell of pine, and be gone from the world in the blink of an eye. The next day, when we packed up and left, none of us spoke about it much. Our parents didn't know we had been near a swamp, or that we had seen a child alone in the forest. The drive back was quiet. The mist clung to the trees along the road, as if the forest itself hadn't let go of us yet. We didn't return to that clearing, didn't talk about it again for years. It became one of those memories that sits in the back of your mind, vivid but unspoken, a reminder that some parts of the woods exist outside understanding. The experience left me with a caution that has never faded. I learned that the forest doesn't owe you safety just because you know the trails, just because you can read maps or pack gear. The ground can turn treacherous in a moment, the fog can hide more than just trees, and a child can wander where none should tread. I never saw the boy again, never knew his name, never found a logical explanation. The footprints remain in my memory, like a photograph I can't develop. Even now, years later, I think about that weekend. I think about the way the mist hung low and thick, how it blurred everything beyond a few feet, how the quiet wasn't natural, it was watchful. I think about the footprints ending in a swamp that should have swallowed anyone who went in. I think about the feeling of being small in the forest, of knowing there is more out there than you can see, and that the world continues whether you understand it or not. I learned that night, and in the following years, that some experiences aren't explained by logic or reason. Some things just happen, and the forest holds them, unremarked and unchanged. And I realized painfully that we were lucky that the boy vanished without harm, lucky that we were only observers. But that luck doesn't teach you peace. It teaches you respect, and a quiet, lingering unease that never leaves when you remember how easy it is to be lost, and how completely the world can close over someone and leave no trace. That weekend, the forest didn't let us sleep. It didn't give answers. It just existed, and in that existence, it reminded us that people can appear, vanish, and leave you with nothing but questions. I remember walking back to our car, the mud still wet under my boots, the fog retreating into the shadows of the pines, and feeling the weight of the emptiness the forest had left behind. It was the kind of silence that never resolves, and the kind of memory that never fades. I set out along the Ouachita National Forest trails just after 9 in the morning. I had my binoculars slung over my shoulder, a notebook tucked into my backpack, and a lightweight camera for capturing birds without disturbing them. The air was warm but not stifling, and the smell of pine sap mixed with damp earth. The trail was narrow, barely more than a worn path through the undergrowth, lined with oaks and hickories. Sunlight pierced the canopy in scattered beams, illuminating patches of moss and the occasional mushroom. Birdsong echoed in the distance, a scattered chorus of high-pitched calls and fluttering wings. I moved slowly, stopping to examine a nuthatch on a low branch, then a flicker disappearing into the foliage. My focus was entirely on the birds, the patterns of their movements, the shape of their beaks, and the subtle differences in color between similar species. By noon, the sun had climbed high, angled through gaps in the trees so that some areas were starkly bright, others deep in shadow. The temperature rose, and my shirt stuck to my back with sweat. I rested for a moment on a fallen log beside the trail, watching a woodpecker hammering at the bark of a standing pine. That's when I first noticed the holes. They were small, circular, spaced unevenly along the trunks of several trees. Some were just above eye level. At first, I assumed they were nesting cavities or feeding holes from woodpeckers. I scanned the trees carefully, jotting notes. They looked normal. The bark around them was rough but not unusual, the edges of the holes worn smooth by repeated activity. I moved closer to examine one, raising my binoculars, and for a fraction of a second, I thought I saw movement inside. A flicker of light, a reflection, like the surface of water catching the sun. I laughed at myself and shook my head. I had been alone for hours, the heat and the focus making me tense. Surely it was just the angle of the sun. I moved on, following the trail that wound along a shallow rise and then descended toward a small creek. The water was clear, barely more than ankle-deep in places, lined with stones and fallen branches. Dragonflies skimmed the surface, their wings catching the sun in quick flashes. I paused to fill my water bottle, setting my pack carefully on a rock so it wouldn't fall in. As I stood up, brushing off my pants, I caught the edge of something out of the corner of my eye. A hole in a tree directly across the trail. Something inside it, dark. I froze. It wasn't moving like an animal. There was no twitch of fur, no movement of wings. It was a black dot, perfectly still like a pupil. My heart rate jumped. I lifted my binoculars again and focused on the hole. There was a small black dot in the center, a tiny circle of reflected light. I blinked. It was still there. I looked away and back. The dot had shifted slightly, adjusting as if it were aware of me. I stepped closer, careful not to make a sound. Then I saw more. Dozens of holes along the nearby trees, all with the same small, dark circle inside. Each one seemed to be watching me, steady and unblinking. My throat went dry. I dropped the binoculars and stepped back, pressing my hands against the rough bark of a tree behind me. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a pattern in the shadows, insects reflecting the sun. But my mind refused the explanation. The holes were too uniform, too precise. The black dots inside them adjusted with my movement. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps some species of bird or insect had nested there, reflecting light from their eyes. But even as I thought it, the slow, deliberate impression of being observed settled over me, pressing down. I took a few hesitant steps forward, telling myself I would move past the area and continue the trail. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling, like dry leaves dragged along the ground, coming from behind me. I turned slowly, scanning the undergrowth. Nothing moved. Only the trees swayed gently in a breeze I couldn't feel on my skin. I swallowed, my hands slick with sweat. I started walking faster, then jogging, keeping my eyes on the path. But the feeling didn't go. Every tree I passed, I imagined those tiny dark holes, pupils following me, calculating my movement. I tried to focus on the creek ahead, the small bridge I had crossed earlier, any landmark that would tell me I was near the parking lot. The trail twisted, dipping down and rising over low ridges. My pack bounced against my back, the straps chafing my shoulders. The sun slanted toward late afternoon, throwing long shadows across the trail. I could hear birds, but none of the usual songs. Only the occasional rustle, a startled flinch of wings that sounded closer than it should have. I dared not look behind me for long, fearing what I might see. My mind raced, cataloging every possibility, from natural explanations to the improbable. But nothing eased the tension. My chest felt tight, each breath shallow. I reached the creek again, the one I had crossed earlier. Stones and fallen branches formed a rough path across, slick with moss. I stepped carefully, testing each one before committing my weight. My eyes flicked toward the opposite bank, toward the trees lining the path back to the lot. And there they were again, dark shapes among the bark, black circles in hollowed wood. My stomach turned. I moved faster, splashing through the shallow water, keeping my balance by reaching for larger stones. The sound of water hitting stone masked the soft rustling behind me. I dared not glance. I focused only on the end of the trail, the familiar clearing near the parking lot, the curve where I had left my car. Finally, I broke through the tree-line into the clearing. Sunlight hit me in full, the air warm, dry, and familiar. My legs shook, my shirt damp with sweat and creek water. I stumbled across the gravel, my shoes crunching harshly, and made it to the edge of the lot. I leaned against the hood of my car, trying to catch my breath. My hands were trembling as I reached into my pack to grab a water bottle. Slowly, cautiously, I turned my head back toward the trees lining the trail. The dark holes were gone. Just bark, shadows, and the ordinary shapes of branches. No black dots, no movement, no watching eyes. I sat in the car for nearly 20 minutes, the engine off, listening to the hum of insects and the occasional bird. I told myself it had been a combination of heat, exhaustion, and hyperfocus. Perhaps some small birds, nesting in odd cavities, had caught the sunlight just so. Perhaps my mind, already strained from hours of solitary observation, had filled in the rest. My heart slowed, though the memory of that sensation, the watching, lingered like a faint echo in my chest. Eventually, I started the car and drove out of the lot, keeping my eyes on the road and the familiar signs of the forest trail giving way to highway. The forest seemed ordinary again, birds moving normally, shadows consistent with the angle of the sun. I told myself the rest of the day would be calm, that I had simply stumbled into a trick of perception. But even later at home, unpacking my equipment, I felt the residual pressure in my chest, the sense of being observed. I knew I would return to the Washita trails another day. I would walk them in the morning, when the light was even and direct, when the shadows could not play tricks. And I would remember every detail, the holes, the black dots, the rustling behind me, so that when I went back, I could see them for what they really were, and finally understand why the forest had seemed to look at me. It was hours later, after I had showered and settled, that I realized I had left the notebook in the car. I returned to retrieve it the next morning. The trail was quiet, sun soft and filtered through leaves. The holes were there, but empty, just natural hollows in the trees, no strange reflections, no pupils blinking back. I studied them for a long time, walking along the path, touching the bark, peering inside. It was as it should have been. Birds would come and go. The forest was alive, and I had been caught off guard by a fleeting trick of light, by the intensity of being alone in the woods, by my focus and fatigue. I wrote the day's observations carefully in my notebook. I noted the species, the locations, the behavior, and though the memory of those dark, staring holes remained vivid in my mind, I understood now that the forest was not strange, only vast, patient, and full of life. I had seen it sharply, too sharply, and it had mirrored my own attention back at me. I left the trail that day with a clear understanding. Sometimes, in the quiet of the forest, the mind will notice too much, will create patterns that are not there, and the safest response is to move carefully, observe fully, and always respect the living world around you. I returned home that afternoon, tired but steady, carrying the memory of the forest with me, not as a threat, but as a reminder of the patience and watchfulness inherent in every living thing. I drove out of Bangor just after noon, taking the narrow back roads that twist through the outskirts of the forest. The sky was overcast, low and gray, promising snow but not yet committing. The air had that sharp edge that Maine carries in late autumn, cold enough to bite at exposed skin, but dry, carrying the smell of damp leaves, pine, and distant wood smoke from cabins tucked away where the main roads ended. I was alone, recently divorced, and 27, carrying a mix of restlessness and quiet desperation that only solitude in the woods could seem to satisfy. Hunting was a way to be somewhere without having to think too hard about anything else. The gun rested in the passenger seat, scoped and cleaned, a familiar weight that grounded me in the routine of something practical, something I understood. I parked at the edge of an old logging trail, gravel turning to dirt and leaves, soft from rain a few days before. The tracks of tires faded into the brush. The forest felt empty, vast, and still in a way that pressed against my chest. I should have felt comfortable. These woods had always been the same, but there was a tension I couldn't shake. Even when nothing moved, the air seemed thick, as if holding its breath. I slung my pack on my shoulders, heavy with gear, and started walking along the trail, boots crunching over wet leaves and broken twigs. My movements were slow, methodical, checking for tracks, looking for signs of deer, listening for the rustle of small animals. The sky leaned darker, the gray clouds lowering as the afternoon waned, and the temperature dipped noticeably. My breath left white streaks in front of me. I found a clearing beside the old trail that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Fallen trees formed natural seats along the perimeter, moss clinging to their bark, and the ground was uneven, laced with roots and decayed leaves. I settled myself there, propping the rifle against a tree, strapping in a small flashlight. I watched the tree lean across the clearing, noting the way the pine and birch blended with the heavier shadows of the undergrowth. The wind was nearly still, just a whisper, carrying the faint scent of rot and pine resin. The air had a chill that made my fingers stiff despite gloves. I adjusted my layers and leaned against a tree, trying to feel grounded, to convince myself this was just another afternoon in the woods. As dusk settled, the dim light made everything seem slightly different. Shapes elongated, shadows deepened. The forest that had felt open now felt enclosed. It was quiet in a way that made my own breathing sound loud, almost intrusive. I noticed a shape at the far edge of the clearing, where the trees thickened. At first, I thought it was a stump or a rock, but then it moved. It was tall, humanoid, though I could not make out distinct features. When I flicked on my flashlight, 2 points of amber reflected sharply, bright and precise, catching the beam like glass. I froze. The light made the reflection sharper, and the figure seemed to step back into shadow, becoming just another part of the dark brush. I blinked and raised the flashlight again, sweeping slowly. Nothing, only the brush and the outlines of trees, swaying faintly in a breeze I could barely feel. I shifted slightly, trying to get a better angle. The reflection appeared again, in the same spot, unblinking. The eyes were high, like a person or something of similar height, too far to be a deer or a smaller animal. My pulse quickened. I reminded myself there were hunters, trappers, and even illegal logging crews in the area. There was always the chance someone was watching from the woods, but the reflection didn't move naturally. It stayed. Every time I moved, it retreated. Every time I stopped, it returned. I called out, softly, half hoping for a response, half hoping it was just a trick of the light. The amber reflected again, and then, for a fraction of a second, it seemed to blink, though no sound came back. My mind tried to rationalize. Deer? No. Moose? Too tall. Another hunter? Maybe, but the behavior didn't fit. I sat still, scanning the treeline with the flashlight, straining to hear anything beyond my own heartbeat. The minutes passed slowly, each one stretching in the cold. My hands trembled, whether from the cold or adrenaline, I couldn't tell. Every sound, the snap of a twig, the distant rustle of leaves, the faint creak of a branch, made me turn, light sweeping the trees. Nothing else appeared, only the stillness and the feeling of being observed. I never took my eyes off that faint reflection of amber in the treeline, trying to map it, trying to anticipate movement. I realized I had become hyper-aware of every minor shift. The wind stirring pine needles, a bird flying low across the clearing, the way shadows pooled under the trunks. My instincts were on edge. I stayed in place, crouched slightly, focusing on the figure, until the fading light made it harder to see the amber. Eventually, the dusk collapsed into near darkness. I packed up, keeping the flashlight low, moving quietly along the trail back toward the truck. My steps were careful, deliberate, boots pressing softly into wet leaves. I looked back frequently, half expecting to see the eyes again, but nothing emerged. I tried to reason with myself. Could have been a hunter, a reflection of my own flashlight in a reflective vest, an optical illusion caused by the fading light and moisture in the air. I told myself this over and over to calm the tightness in my chest. I reached the truck just as the last light faded. The forest behind me was a solid wall of dark, the trees indistinguishable from one another. I unlocked the door and got in, trying to shake the tension. The engine started easily, but as I reached around to close the door, I caught the scratches. Deep, long, running along the side near the door handle. Fresh. I touched them with a gloved hand. They were jagged, uneven, not consistent with brush or rocks from the road. The metal was bent in small places. I went around the vehicle, checking the whole perimeter. Nothing. No branches leaning oddly, no signs of a struggle, no footprints in the thin layer of dirt beside the road. I ran my hands over the marks, trying to understand. A rock? Unlikely. Another vehicle? Impossible. No one had been near me. I felt a chill colder than the late autumn air. I drove home slowly, headlights cutting through the dark, keeping my mind occupied with the rational explanations. Maybe it was a hunter's prank, someone tracking me, or even a large animal testing the metal as it passed. I told myself it made sense, even if I didn't fully believe it. The scratches remained on my truck for weeks, and I never found another trace of the figure. I returned to those woods several times after that day, taking different trails, different spots, and nothing repeated. No amber reflections, no watching shapes. The feeling of being observed stayed with me longer than any visible sign. It was a day that stayed clear in my memory, precise in its ordinary details, the color of the leaves, the cold in my fingers, the smell of the forest, and the one extraordinary thing I couldn't explain, but knew I had seen. I understood the forest better after that, the way its stillness could press against a person, how easily perception could be warped by shadow, distance, and the mind alone. I learned to respect the quiet, to move carefully, and to accept that not everything in the woods needed a reason. The scratches on my truck were evidence, tangible and irrefutable, that something had been there, even if I never knew what. I had been planning the hike to the old fire tower near Teodotin State Forest for weeks. I kept a journal of every fire lookout I visited, filling pages with notes about their construction, history, and surrounding landscape. This one had drawn my attention because it was little known, far off any marked trail, and the last records of it suggested it hadn't been used in decades. I wanted to see it before it collapsed entirely. I left my college town mid-morning, carrying a small pack with water, a flashlight, and my journal, dressed in layers because the forecast predicted a cool evening even though the day had started warm. The trail was faint. At first, it followed a ridge lined with tall white pines. Their needles smelled faintly of resin, and the air was dry, carrying the scent deep into my nose with each step. The forest floor was uneven, littered with broken branches and the occasional patch of moss. I had to pay attention to each step because the path disappeared often, forcing me to push aside saplings or climb over fallen trees. Every now and then, I stopped to make notes, recording the slope, the density of the forest, how much sunlight filtered through the canopy. By late afternoon, the incline had steepened. My boots were covered in mud from a small, eroded stream that crossed the trail. I paused to wipe them on a tree trunk and catch my breath. The forest felt silent, but not empty. Every so often, a bird called in the distance or a squirrel scurried through the underbrush. The quiet made me conscious of every sound my own body made: the crunch of leaves, the scrape of my pack against my back, the shallow rhythm of my breathing. I had been alone for hours, and the solitude felt both familiar and heavy. The sun was beginning to dip behind the western ridge when I reached the clearing at the base of the tower. It rose abruptly from the forest floor, metal framework rusted and streaked with weather, the ladder leading up almost vertical. I could see that someone, or something, had left a rope tangled around the lower rungs. It swung gently, catching the faint breeze, scraping against the metal with a slow squeal that cut through the stillness. I hesitated for a moment, resting my hands on the bottom rung. My muscles ached from the hike, my shoulders stiff. I looked around. The forest stretched in every direction, a mixture of shadow and fading light, and I was aware that the next stretch would be the hardest part. I started climbing. The metal was cold under my fingers. The ladder creaked as I shifted my weight, the rope brushing against my arm. I climbed slowly, taking care not to rush, trying to steady my breath. The top platform was small and square, just enough for the observation cabin. I stepped onto it and paused, looking over the forest canopy. The view was expansive, the trees stretching for miles, their tops swaying slightly in the evening breeze. I pulled out my journal, intending to make a note about the perspective, the way the light changed across the ridges, but then I noticed something I hadn't expected. Inside the tower, a chair faced the forest. In it sat an outline of a person, or something that looked like one. The figure was completely still. There was no movement at all, no shifting, no breath visible, and no facial features I could make out. I froze. My heart raced in a slow, building panic. The chair's occupant seemed impossible, yet tangible. I swallowed, trying to reason with myself. Perhaps it was a jacket or some discarded equipment. But the proportions were perfect, seated like a human, and it gave off an impression of deliberate stillness that made my skin crawl. I blinked. The figure was gone. The chair remained, now empty, but it was rocking very gently back and forth, as if the forest itself had left it in motion. I stepped closer, my boots scraping against the wooden floor. Nothing in the tower indicated anyone had been there recently. No footprints beyond mine on the dust-covered platform, no belongings. I touched the chair. It was cold, heavy metal old. I could feel the slight swing beneath my fingers, consistent and slow. I spent hours up there, writing, sketching the platform, counting the rings and the wooden posts, noting the trajectory of the fading light. Through it all, the chair rocked in tiny, unbroken movements, a quiet counterpoint to the solitude around me. The sun disappeared completely, leaving the forest in deep, uniform shadow. The air cooled sharply. I wrapped myself tighter in my jacket, watching the ridges and treetops. No wildlife moved nearby, no wind stirred the canopy. Only the chair moved. I tried to listen for explanations, the settling of the structure, perhaps, but the metal and wood were old, dry, and solid. Nothing else creaked or groaned. I felt completely alone, yet intensely observed, as if the space itself carried the memory of another presence. I tried to ground myself by making notes, cataloging everything I saw, and recording the exact rhythm of the chair's rocking. Eventually, night fully enveloped the forest. I set up my small flashlight, illuminating the floor of the cabin, the chair, the metal bars of the ladder. The shadows of the forest stretched across the cabin walls, creating a pattern of moving darkness as the light swayed. I thought of the hours I had spent climbing and hiking to reach this point. Exhaustion was creeping in, but my mind remained alert, every small noise amplified in the still tower. I traced the outlines of the posts, the rungs of the ladder, the empty chair, and the forest beyond. At some point, the chair stopped moving. I don't know exactly when. I felt a subtle shift in the tower's atmosphere, the weight of the forest outside pressing in. I had the urge to stay, to witness whatever had occurred in the fading light, but I knew I needed to descend before the dark became total. I grabbed my pack, secured my flashlight, and started down the ladder, carefully placing each foot on the cold metal rungs. My muscles protested after hours of tension and climbing. When my boots finally touched the forest floor again, the clearing felt impossibly vast and empty. I walked back along the trail slowly, taking careful notes of the path, the gradient, and markers I had passed. The forest at night was different, sounds sharper, shadows deeper, the canopy almost complete above. I kept my flashlight trained on the ground, stepping over roots and mud patches, feeling the ache in my shoulders and legs from the climb. I didn't look back at the tower until I was 100 yards away, and even then it was only a silhouette, still standing in the darkness. By the time I reached the edge of the forest where my car was parked, the sky was fully black, stars faint through thin cloud cover. I sat in the driver's seat, heart still racing, and wrote detailed notes in my journal about the entire experience. The climb, the figure, the chair, the rocking, the silence. I tried to explain everything logically. Maybe someone had been in the tower earlier that day, a hiker or a hunter, and the chair had been disturbed by the wind or the slight shift in the metal platform. Maybe I had been too tired, too tense, too focused on the journey to interpret shadows accurately. But the impression of being observed, the unbroken stillness of that outline, and the slow rocking of the chair could not be fully explained away. I drove home slowly, still writing in my journal during breaks, trying to document the trail accurately so that I could revisit it under daylight. By the time I arrived at my apartment, the muscles in my legs ached, and the fatigue settled deep into my bones. I read through my notes again and realized that what made this experience so unsettling was not the unknown itself, but the absolute normalcy of it. There was nothing supernatural, nothing impossible. Just a chair, a tower, a forest, and the small, inexplicable presence I had felt in the fading light. The next day, I returned with a friend, and the chair was just a chair, empty and still. The rope had fallen against the ladder. Nothing moved except the wind through the trees. I climbed to the platform again, careful to note every detail. The forest stretched endlessly, the same as the day before. The feeling of being watched did not return. But when I write about that night in my journal, I always record the rocking chair and the outline I thought I saw. It is part of the tower's story now, part of the memory I carry, a reminder that some experiences in the forest remain intensely personal, shaped by exhaustion, solitude, and the mind's way of interpreting quiet, unexpected moments. I've been back to other towers since, and none have given me the same unease. The Teotihuacan Tower remains different, not because anything supernatural happened, but because it made me aware of how fragile perception can be in isolation. The forest is patient and silent, and it can hold a presence without a person there, a quiet proof that even in the most ordinary settings, the mind can feel watched, the air can feel charged, and a single empty chair can seem alive. The memory of climbing that ladder, of pausing to look over the canopy, and of seeing that outline will stay with me always. I drove up the narrow, winding roads of the Green Mountains that afternoon, carrying only my camera bag and a small backpack with water and a snack. I had read about an abandoned cabin tucked deep into the forest along Maple Hollow, a place that had been left empty since the 1960s. The directions were vague, relying on old maps and a few notes from local hiking blogs, but that was part of the appeal. I wanted photographs that felt untouched, isolated, something that could only exist far from roads and neighborhoods. By the time I left the car and started down the trail, the sun was already leaning low in the sky, a muted gray washing over the treetops. The air was cool, damp, carrying the smell of wet pine needles and earth. The path itself was narrow and overgrown. Fallen leaves covered the dirt, softening my steps but also hiding roots and rocks. I had to watch my footing carefully as the trail wound deeper into the forest, past sections of moss-covered boulders and thick stands of birch and maple. The woods were quiet except for the occasional crack of a branch under a squirrel's paw or the distant rattle of a woodpecker. There were no other hikers, no cars in the distance, just the faint echo of my own boots on the trail and the occasional whisper of wind moving through the treetops. After an hour of hiking, the trail opened onto a small clearing. The cabin appeared ahead, partially obscured by a tangle of saplings and undergrowth. At first, it looked exactly as I had pictured from the photos online. Walls of gray, rotting wood, windows smashed and hanging crookedly on their frames. The roof sagged in the middle, shingles missing, revealing dark holes where daylight seeped through. I paused at the edge of the clearing and raised my camera, framing the cabin through the lens. The light was already soft and flat, the shadows weak but heavy, casting a dull gloom over the structure. As I approached, I noticed something unusual. The ground near the front of the cabin was disturbed, footprints pressed into the damp soil. They were too large to be mine and too irregular to belong to a deer or other animal. They led in a wide loop, circling the cabin several times before vanishing into the woods. I crouched to look closer. The prints were deep, pressed into the earth as if someone had been pacing, shifting weight from foot to foot. My stomach tightened. I had expected the place to be empty, isolated, abandoned. These prints suggested otherwise. I told myself it was probably someone who had passed through recently, maybe a hiker or another photographer. The trail wasn't heavily used, but it wasn't impossible. I took several shots of the cabin, careful to catch the texture of the wood, the broken glass, the angles of decay. My camera made a soft click, and I tried to ignore the rising sense of being watched. The forest felt different somehow. The shadows between the trees were sharper, darker. The air seemed heavier, carrying a faint, almost imperceptible rustle that I couldn't place. I decided it was time to leave. I turned toward the trail, but the moment I did, I heard it, wood creaking, slow and deliberate, from the direction of the cabin. There was no wind. The trees stood perfectly still. The sound was close, like someone shifting on the porch or a floorboard settling under weight. I froze, straining to listen. Nothing else moved. My heart began to race. I stepped back onto the trail and started walking faster, trying to tell myself it was just the building settling. Almost immediately, I felt it, the feeling of being followed. My steps no longer sounded alone. I could hear extra thuds, irregular and heavier than mine, moving with a rhythm that didn't match my own. I glanced over my shoulder. The trees swayed faintly in the gray light, but I saw nothing at all. I broke into a run, stumbling over roots and uneven ground. The trail seemed longer than before, twisting back on itself, the forest pressing in on both sides. Each time my foot hit a branch or a rock, there was a second sound immediately after, too deliberate, too heavy to be random. My breath came fast, shallow, and the camera bounced against my chest, straps digging into my shoulders. I didn't stop until the canopy thinned, and the trail sloped downward toward the parking area. When I reached my car, I leaned against the door, hands trembling, trying to calm myself. I pulled out my camera, hoping reviewing the shots would distract me, would make everything feel normal again. Most of the photos were what I expected. Angled shots of the cabin, the peeling paint, the broken windows, the forest surrounding it. Then I noticed one image I hadn't taken. The camera display showed the cabin, but in the doorway, just beyond the frame I remembered shooting, there was a figure. Tall, impossibly thin, limbs bent at unnatural angles, crouched as if waiting or watching. The proportions didn't make sense. I hadn't framed the shot like that. The shadow was darker than anything the lighting should have allowed, yet distinct, precise. My stomach dropped. My hands shook as I zoomed in. The figure's head was low, tilted slightly, the shoulders hunched unnaturally. It wasn't a person I had seen. I didn't hear anything while I was there, at least, not that I consciously registered. I reviewed the other shots carefully. Nothing else looked out of place. Every angle I had taken of the cabin showed no one, just the empty porch and broken windows. Yet this one image existed, captured by the camera's internal sensor in the exact moment I had been crouching to take a shot. It wasn't a reflection, it wasn't a trick of the light. There was no way to explain it with a passing hiker. I started the car slowly, keeping an eye on the trailhead. The forest seemed denser now, more foreboding. Every shadow between the trees looked like a figure poised to step forward. I didn't stop until the gravel of the parking lot gave way to the paved road, and then I drove faster than I should have, ignoring the turns and curves, just wanting to leave the woods behind. At home, I uploaded the photos to my computer. I examined the metadata. The mysterious image had the same timestamp as the one I remembered taking, the same exposure settings, the same focus. There was no anomaly in the camera itself. The figure was in the exact spot it appeared, crouched outside the cabin. I never returned to Maple Hollow. I checked local records and hiking forums. No one reported living near the cabin. The closest town was miles away. I couldn't find a logical explanation. I eventually stopped looking for one. The image remains on my hard drive. I've shown it to others who often suggest someone or something was hiding in the woods. I don't know. I only know that when I'm out in the forest now, I move with the assumption that I am not alone, even when everything seems empty. That day in the Green Mountains changed how I see the woods, how I hear the wind, how I trust what I see. It was just a cabin, just a trail, just me. But something else had been there, and I couldn't tell what it wanted or how close it had come. I never returned to Maple Hollow, and I doubt I ever will. The memory of that trail, the creaking wood, the footsteps that didn't match my own, and the shadow captured in my photograph is enough to make me keep my distance from places like that. I still go into the forest, still take pictures, but I choose paths that are well-marked, well-traveled, and I never, ever linger near abandoned structures. The woods can be empty, and they can be quiet, but I know now that quiet does not mean safety. I arrived at the lake just before noon, my truck crunching over the hard-packed snow that covered the small logging road leading in. The air was sharp and cold, the kind of cold that makes your lungs ache with every inhale and leaves a metallic taste on your tongue. My brother was already setting up near the center of the frozen expanse, a spot he said had produced decent catches the previous year. The lake itself stretched wide, surrounded on all sides by dense forest, trees heavily burdened with snow. Pines, firs, and a few stubborn birches leaned toward the water, their branches cracking under the weight, occasionally shedding a heavy layer that thudded onto the ice. The northern wind blew in steady gusts, carrying a hollow, whistling sound through the trees that made the silence of the lake feel less empty and more tense. We worked in silence at first. He drilled the holes while I laid out our small collection of gear: ice augers, a couple of folding chairs, tackle boxes, and a thermos filled with coffee that had long since cooled. The lake gleamed under the pale winter sun, but there was no warmth. Snowflakes drifted down, slow and sparse, catching in my eyelashes. I could hear the faint groan of the ice as we stepped across it, a subtle, shifting noise that reminded me how precarious the frozen surface could be even when it looked solid. My brother settled into his chair and started lowering his line while I prepared mine. I glanced at the trees bordering the lake, noting the density of them, the way the shadows stretched long and jagged across the ice as the sun began its descent. Even in daylight, the forest looked dark and quiet, almost impenetrable. Hours passed slowly. The occasional tug on a line reminded us we were catching fish, but mostly it was just the wind and the scraping of our auger bits through ice holes. Around 4, the light started to change. It wasn't the golden glow of sunset, but something colder, more diffuse, as if the sky itself was growing heavier. The forest edges seemed to darken first, the shadows pressing inward, and I noticed a subtle tension in the air, like it was waiting. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the winter evening settling in, but there was a weight in the silence I couldn't ignore. By 6, the wind had picked up. Snow blew sideways, stinging any exposed skin. I zipped my jacket tighter, pulled the hood over my head, and checked the lines again. The lake had grown silent except for the wind and the occasional creak of ice under our feet. It was around this time that I noticed a faint sound from the forest, a low groaning or rumbling that didn't fit with the wind. I paused, trying to place it, but it didn't repeat. My brother didn't seem to hear it, focused on his line, and I didn't want to point it out yet. Then it came, a guttural howl, long and resonant, rising from deep in the forest. It wasn't a wolf. I've spent enough time in the woods to recognize the difference between a coyote, a wolf, and the occasional dog. This was something else. It had the depth of a large animal, the kind of strength that made you feel the sound in your chest. It echoed across the ice, bouncing between trees, and the hair on my neck prickled. My brother froze as well, his body tensing, and I could see the same realization in his posture. We didn't speak, didn't move. The sound came again, closer this time, and then further, circling around us without revealing itself. It was deliberate, almost knowing. We packed quickly, throwing gear into the sled and folding chairs, the snow muffling our movements but doing little to hide the sense that something was tracking us. Every gust of wind seemed to carry movement from the tree line. Branches cracked somewhere to the left, but there was no rustle of leaves, no animal bounding away. The howl returned, now interspersed with noises that could have been breaking branches or the heavy padding of a creature too large to identify. We walked fast, careful not to slip on the ice, trying to make it to the tree line that led to the road. The shadows pressed in closer, and the forest felt alive in a way I had never experienced before, not with wind or snow, but with intent. By the time we reached the edge of the trees, the last light was fading. Snow fell thicker now, frosting our hats and shoulders. I could barely make out the path to the road, and my brother's footprints ahead were half covered almost as soon as they were made. That's when the sound began again, moving with us, circling. It wasn't constant but timed, deliberate, each noise falling just after we moved, like it was watching and calculating. My stomach turned. I kept telling myself it was a bear or something large, and bears can be dangerous, but nothing about the sounds matched any animal I'd ever heard. Finally, the road came into view, and we broke through the last stretch of trees. The truck's headlights were dim against the deepening dusk, but it was enough. We didn't stop, didn't look back, and climbed in as quickly as we could. The engine roared to life, the sound unfamiliar after the hours of silence, and I glanced once at the dark forest. The howl had stopped suddenly, cutting off as if someone had turned a switch. I exhaled slowly, my chest tight, my hands gripping the steering wheel. The snow on the roadside caught my attention next. Footprints pressed into the soft snow, massive and human-shaped, easily twice as wide as any person could make. Claw-like gouges marked the edges, deep enough to leave a shadow in the fading light. They led to the edge of the forest and disappeared into the darkness, stopping just short of the road. I studied them, my mind racing. Nothing we had seen or known could have made prints like that. They were real, physical, and terrifying, evidence of something that had followed us closely and chosen not to cross the last line into the road. I never went back to that lake. We left immediately, driving slowly, scanning the edges of the forest with every curve. The rest of the night passed without incident, but the memory of the sounds and the prints stayed with me. For days afterward, I thought about what we had heard and seen, trying to reconcile it with the animals and predators I knew. I never found an answer that made sense. The experience was grounding and unnerving at the same time, a reminder of how small we are and how much of the forest remains beyond our understanding. Years later, I returned to the area, cautiously, in daylight and with other fishermen. The lake looked harmless, even inviting, the trees peaceful in the sun. Nothing was unusual. The prints had vanished under seasons of snow and rain. I left, content to watch from the shore and never venture alone or after dark. The fear wasn't gone, but it had been replaced by respect. That lake, that forest, was bigger than us, and sometimes it reminded us we weren't in control. The memory of the howl, the circle of sound, and the massive prints remained sharp in my mind, a quiet warning of the unknown that lives in the woods when the wind blows cold and the snow is deep. I remember the day clearly, even now. It was early September, the air in the Cascade Mountains crisp but not yet cold, the kind of weather that makes your lungs feel full with each breath. My two friends and I had been planning the backpacking trip for months, picking a route that followed a small creek up toward a waterfall we'd read about in a trail guide. The forest was dense, spruce and cedar stretching high, their needles carpeting the ground, so that even our boots made almost no sound. The sun filtered through the canopy in streaks, turning the mossy banks of the creek a muted green and gold. The smell of wet earth and decaying leaves filled the air, grounding me in a way that only deep woods can. We hiked steadily, each of us carrying packs loaded with water, food, tents, and sleeping gear. We had chosen a route that was less traveled, a narrow trail that wound tightly along the hillside and dipped occasionally to cross small tributaries. There was a quiet to the woods, a subtle, omnipresent hum of life, the rush of water over rocks, the occasional bird that called from a distance, the soft rustle of something moving in the underbrush. But beyond that, nothing. Not even the wind seemed to reach the floor of the forest here. By mid-afternoon, we reached the clearing where the waterfall was supposed to be. It was smaller than expected, a cascade more than a plunge, but it had carved a deep pool into the rocks, the water dark and smooth, reflecting the surrounding pines. The area smelled fresher, damp with the mist rising from the pool. We dropped our packs and started scouting for a campsite. That's when we saw it. The clearing had a small fire pit ringed with stones, smoothed by repeated use, and a hammock strung between two cedar trees. A backpack sat upright near the pit, leaning slightly, with an ID sticking out of a side pocket. At first, I thought it had been left by a previous hiker who had returned to town, but everything looked arranged for immediate use. There was firewood stacked neatly beside the pit, a small tin cup perched on a rock, and a rolled-up sleeping pad tucked under the hammock. The ID was old enough to make me doubt whether the person was around, but the pack looked too clean, as though it had been recently touched. We debated for maybe 10 minutes whether to leave it alone. One of my friends suggested we mark the location and come back, thinking the owner might return. I didn't like the idea. Something in the air felt off. The way the hammock hung, slightly sagging in the middle, the way the fire pit stones seemed warm though the ashes were gray, the way the backpack leaned at an angle that implied recent use. There was no one in sight, no tracks leading in or out that we could see, but I could feel that something had been here very recently. Curiosity outweighed caution. We set up our tents a short distance from the existing site, out of the immediate clearing, but still close enough to see the water. I kept glancing toward the hammock as I arranged my sleeping bag. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet. Even the creek's murmur seemed distant, muted. As night fell, the forest changed. Shadows lengthened and thickened, merging into a continuous darkness beyond the light of our headlamps. The stars were mostly hidden by the canopy, and the waterfall's noise became the only constant sound. Then I noticed it, a soft crunching on the leaves, just outside the small circle of light from our camp. At first, I assumed it was an animal, deer or raccoon moving through the underbrush. But then the noises grew more deliberate, circling us slowly. I could hear tiny twigs snap underfoot, faint but sharp, coming closer, and then retreating in a pattern I couldn't identify. I held my breath, straining to hear, and realized that the fire pit in the clearing was different. The ashes weren't just gray, they were tinged with dark embers, faintly glowing like someone had added a small bit of wood very recently. The hammock swayed slightly, though no wind stirred the branches above. My friends didn't notice at first, or maybe they didn't want to. We didn't speak. We couldn't. I wanted to leave, but my body refused to move. The circling continued for hours, or maybe minutes, but it felt like hours. Every now and then, a faint brush of sound came from the trees just beyond the clearing. We weren't alone, I knew, but there was no figure, no shadow, no silhouette, nothing human to see. My heart beat hard in my chest. Every instinct screamed that someone or something had been watching. The more I tried to rationalize, the less sense it made. Whoever or whatever it was had left no tracks, no footprints, no scent that we could detect. By midnight, I was trembling. The hammock swayed again, a long, slow movement that shouldn't have been possible without someone touching it. The fire pit glowed brighter for a moment, as though someone had poked the embers. I realized then that lingering here wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. I didn't know what dangerous meant exactly. Maybe it was a person, maybe someone reckless, maybe someone hiding somewhere in the woods. But it wasn't natural to be this close to civilization and feel utterly watched. We packed up our tent silently, taking care not to disturb anything more than necessary. The backpack sat where it had been, still upright, still clean. I wanted to grab it, wanted to check for clues, but I didn't. The moment I touched it, I felt I would draw attention, and that was a risk I wasn't willing to take. We moved quietly, gathering our gear, putting packs on, checking our shoelaces and securing straps, all the while listening. The forest seemed to hold its breath along with us. By the time we stepped into the trail leading back, the first hints of light touched the horizon. The forest was waking slowly, the usual birds calling, the creek singing down its rocks, but the tension clung to me. Every snapping branch, every falling pine needle made me flinch. We didn't look back. We didn't stop. When we finally reached the trailhead and the parking area, our legs stiff from the long hike and our minds exhausted, the feeling lifted gradually. I looked back once toward the ridge where the waterfall and clearing were, and nothing had changed. No smoke, no movement, just the trees swaying gently in the morning breeze. I never knew if anyone had been there, if the noises were a person sneaking around, or just my mind exaggerating the isolation, but it didn't matter. We had been close to something we didn't understand, and the safest thing was to leave it undisturbed. We drove away in silence, the forest disappearing behind us, and I knew I would never return to that waterfall clearing. The memory stayed with me, not as fear of a ghost or a monster, but as a reminder of how the forest can be alive in ways you can't fully measure, and how curiosity can put you closer to danger than you ever expect. We hiked in for adventure, and we left with nothing but the sight of a quiet camp, a swaying hammock, and the weight of being watched in a place that should have been empty. Even now, I can close my eyes and see the clearing, hear the embers shift in the pit, feel the slow sway of the hammock. The memory is vivid, grounded, and unnerving because it was real. Nothing supernatural, nothing imagined. It was just a human presence, unseen, perfectly still, and completely in control. It was enough. Enough to make me never forget the cascades, never underestimate the quiet, and never ignore the small signs that something is there, even if you can't see it. We never went back. The waterfall remains unnamed to me. The forest remains empty in my memory, except for that one clearing, that one night, and the lingering sense of being observed. I went hiking with two friends for a weekend near Mount Shasta, hoping to escape the crowded trails and find a quiet stretch of forest where the pine needles were thick on the ground and the air smelled of resin and cold stone. We planned to follow a little-known ridge, far from the main paths, where we could move slowly and take in the views without the chatter of other hikers. The drive up was long, winding through highways lined with burnt trees from last year's fires, their blackened trunks sticking out of the hills like skeletons. By the time we parked and started walking, the sun was already low in the sky, turning the western clouds a pale orange and dusting the mountains with soft shadows. The trail we had followed at first was faint, narrow, barely more than a line through thick underbrush. The pines leaned over us, their tops rustling in the wind, and the smell of smoke from distant wildfires hung in the air, mixing with the dampness of the soil. We were moving slowly, stopping now and then to check a map or to look for a landmark we thought we recognized. Around 3 in the afternoon, we realized we had lost the trail entirely. The path we thought was leading up the ridge ended abruptly at a tangle of fallen branches and dense saplings. I remember looking around and feeling the sudden quiet press in on us, heavier than any forest silence I had ever noticed. The ridge itself was steep, and the forest thickened as we climbed. Shadows fell across the ground in patterns the sun could barely reach. Somewhere above us, a bird lifted into the sky, startled by our presence, and its cry sounded small and lonely in the vastness of the trees. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, I heard it, a high-pitched scream, human-like but wrong, cutting through the air and echoing off the slopes. It made my stomach tighten, a cold knot of dread forming that I couldn't shake. My friends froze for a second, listening, before we all started moving again, faster this time, eyes scanning the trees for whatever had made that sound. We didn't speak, because any sound seemed to make the echo stronger, closer. The forest closed around us. Branches cracked underfoot, and every step we took sent dry needles and loose bark tumbling down the slope. Then the sound of snapping branches behind us made us all break into a run. It wasn't coordinated, just desperate, uncontrolled. We crashed through the undergrowth, trying to retrace our steps, to find a path we recognized, but everything looked the same. Endless trunks, low branches, scattered rocks. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs, my lungs burning with the cold, dry air. The sun dropped completely behind the ridge while we were still running, and the temperature fell quickly. The smoke in the air made the darkness seem even thicker, dulling the moonlight and hiding the contours of the ground. Every shadow looked like it could hold something waiting. My friends and I stumbled over roots and rocks, our shoes catching on loose pine cones, our hands clawing at branches to steady ourselves. The screams, or something like them, echoed intermittently, distant yet disturbingly near, and we could hear the heavy steps that weren't ours, moving through the underbrush, careful but relentless. Around midnight, we found a small clearing. The firelight from the distant hills spilled down through the trees, painting the needles in an orange glow. That light made the shadows move like liquid, stretching and shifting across the clearing. My breath came in ragged gasps as I stumbled toward the center, hoping to see something familiar, some mark of the trail. Instead, I froze. The ground was covered with footprints, circling in a perfect spiral, each one far too large to belong to a human. They were deep and wide, the soil pressed down in a way that suggested weight and movement, deliberate and slow, and the spiral was tight, precise, as if whatever had made them had spent time walking there, waiting, watching. I backed up without thinking, my foot crunching against a branch. My friends were behind me, their faces pale in the firelight, and we all looked at the prints for a long moment before moving. The forest felt alive with presence then, like the trees themselves were leaning in to watch. Every sound, the rustling of needles, the crack of branches, the occasional high wind, made us jump. We didn't stop running. We followed the slope downward as best we could, keeping the ridge above us on our right, moving toward the direction we hoped would lead to a road or any sign of human presence. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes. The ground became rocky, the forest thinner, but the sense of being followed never left. The prints in the clearing haunted me, a mental image that I couldn't shake, a reminder that we hadn't been alone. Occasionally, we would hear another scream, closer this time, or the snap of a branch behind us, and we would all lurch forward, feet pounding against uneven ground, sweat and blood and dirt mixing on our hands and faces. By the first light of morning, we reached a road. It was unpaved, quiet, cutting through the forest like a thin gray line. My legs were stiff and sore, my throat dry, but the relief of seeing civilization was almost unbearable. We walked along it slowly, scanning for cars or any sign that we could finally leave the forest behind. When we saw a truck approaching, we waved until it slowed and stopped. The driver looked at us, confused, but we didn't care. We climbed in without saying a word, the exhaustion and adrenaline leaving us too drained to speak. As the truck drove away, I looked back at the ridge. In the daylight, it seemed less menacing, a collection of trees and rocks, smoke in the distance softening the edges of the forest. The spiral of footprints, the screams, the branches snapping, it all felt unreal, like a nightmare half remembered. my friends, and I didn't speak about it much afterward. The experience was private, something that belonged to the three of us and to the forest. Even weeks later, I could still see the prints in my mind. I didn't know what had followed us, if it had been an animal or something else, but I knew that nothing in my experience could explain the precision of the spiral or the sheer size of the footprints. Mount Shasta itself seemed peaceful now, distant and silent, but the ridge we had lost ourselves on remained vivid, a place I would never return to willingly. The sense of being watched, of running with no end in sight, stayed with me for a long time, a reminder that even familiar wilderness can hide something we cannot understand, something patient and quiet, waiting in the dark. We made it back safely, and that was the ending, but the memory of it never left. The forest, the smoke, the ridge, and those prints, they remained perfectly clear. I never went back to that trail, never wanted to. I could tell people about it, but no words could capture the feeling of being small, alone, and relentlessly observed in the deep woods, knowing only that whatever had been out there had been patient enough to wait until we were lost before showing itself. The story ended the moment we hit the road, the relief of leaving the forest intact and complete, yet the ridge stayed with me, quietly in my mind, reminding me of how alone we can be when the forest is real, and nothing else is around. I was driving home from a friend's wedding in Missoula, tired and buzzed from the day's celebration. The sun had already gone down, leaving a slate-gray sky that melted into darkness as I followed the GPS out of town. I wasn't paying much attention, just letting the roads carry me north toward home, and somewhere along the way I took a wrong turn. The GPS kept recalculating, but the roads were narrower, steeper, twisting into the mountains, and eventually it stopped giving directions altogether. I realized I was on an unmarked logging road somewhere deep in the Bitterroots. The trees pressed in from both sides, tall pines with thick undergrowth, and the wind made their branches scrape together in a way that sounded like nails on glass. I tried to keep going, hoping it would loop back to a main road, but the gravel became rougher, bigger potholes and loose stones bouncing my tires. The headlights barely reached 50 feet ahead, and the road ahead seemed endless, black and tight between the trees. I was alone, which didn't bother me much at first, but the silence started pressing against me as I drove. By 10 o'clock, the car started sputtering. At first, I thought it was just a rough patch of road, but the engine quit entirely a few hundred feet later. I tried turning it over, but nothing. The dash lights flickered once, and then went dark. I was on a slight incline, surrounded by pitch-black woods, and the gravel road disappeared into the trees behind me. I sat for a moment, letting my eyes adjust, trying to think through my options. My phone showed 1 bar, but it was enough to get a message out, maybe if I could get higher. I grabbed my flashlight, locked the doors, and stepped out into the chill night. The air was crisp and smelled faintly of pine and wet earth, the kind of clean mountain air that hits the lungs sharply after city air. My footsteps crunched on the gravel as I moved a few dozen feet away from the car, looking for a rise or a clearing where the signal might be stronger. At first, everything was normal. The sound of the wind in the pines, a distant owl, my own breathing. Then I noticed it, another set of sounds, matching mine perfectly. A light crack of a branch, a crunch of gravel. I froze. Another step. Another. It was walking exactly like me, behind me, matching each movement, though no one was visible. I swung my flashlight toward the trees, scanning, and the beam picked up nothing but dark trunks and the occasional reflection of dew on leaves. The steps continued, always just behind me, perfectly synchronized. There was no way it was another human. The road was isolated, deep in the mountains, miles from any other car or house. I stopped, heart hammering, and the steps stopped. I stepped forward again, slowly, and the sound resumed, matching me exactly. I tried to convince myself it was some animal, a bear or a deer, but the timing, the rhythm, the way it mirrored my exact steps, it was impossible. It didn't snap branches where it walked. It didn't leave any sound of weight hitting the gravel, just these echoing, uncanny footsteps. I started moving faster, my flashlight swinging wildly. The beam caught something in the underbrush, a glint of light, like eyes reflecting back. 2, or maybe more. Small pinpoints at first, then larger, closer, staring at me from between the thick trunks and bushes. The eyes were bright, almost unnaturally so in the dark, reflecting the narrow beam in a way that made them feel aware. I ran. My feet slipped on the gravel, my breath coming fast and harsh, the flashlight bouncing, cutting through the trees in frantic sweeps. The sounds of movement followed me, staying just out of sight, and the eyes vanished and reappeared elsewhere. I didn't stop. I ran blindly, pushing through brush, tripping over roots, lungs burning, arms clawing at branches. The forest seemed to close in, dense, unyielding. Every step forward was a fight against the shadows that seemed to watch, waiting. Eventually, I made it back to the car, gasping, shaking. My hands were wet with sweat, my shirt stuck to my back. I slammed the door, locked it, and fumbled with the keys. When I turned the ignition, the engine roared to life immediately, and the headlights cut through the dark like knives. That's when I noticed it. Scratches. Across the hood, long, thin scratches that hadn't been there when I left town. They looked like claw marks, irregular, deep enough to catch the paint, starting near the windshield and extending toward the bumper. My mind reeled. There was no way anyone had been there without me seeing or hearing them. The road had been empty, and the forest dense. I checked the back, thinking maybe a branch had caught it while I parked on the gravel shoulder. But the marks were deliberate, too precise, too organized for a random snag. I ran my fingers over them, feeling the rough metal beneath the paint, trying to rationalize. Rocks bouncing on gravel? No, they were vertical, streaking down in a pattern nothing natural could make. Animal? Maybe, but nothing that size could have climbed onto the hood without leaving footprints, without making noise. My stomach twisted, and I realized how completely alone I was. I decided to leave, slowly, carefully. I kept the headlights focused on the road ahead, scanning every tree line as I drove, every shadow threatening to move. The scratches stayed in my mind, sharp and vivid. I drove slowly at first, checking behind, trying to see if anything followed, but the road stretched endlessly, dark and silent. No lights, no sounds, nothing but my car, the gravel under the tires, and the wind in the trees. The rhythm of the forest felt different now, tense, waiting. I knew I couldn't stop again, not until I reached a town or a main highway. Missoula had seemed far when I left. Now, any light or sound of civilization felt impossibly distant. I kept driving, winding down the mountains. Eventually, the road improved, trees thinned, and faint lights appeared in the distance. Relief came slowly, as if my body didn't quite trust it. I drove through a small, empty town and finally reached the main road leading back toward home. I pulled over at a gas station, hands trembling, shaking water out of my hair, checking the hood again. The scratches were still there, real, undeniable. I ran a cloth over them, cleaned the metal, checked for dents or other signs of tampering. There was none. I thought about leaving a note, reporting it, but it felt pointless. The road, the forest, the isolation, no one would believe me. And maybe I didn't want them to. Something about knowing that the forest could move around you, mirror you, watch you, stayed with me. The knowledge that you could be utterly alone yet followed, observed, in a way you couldn't track or anticipate, was permanent. I drove home slowly all the way, headlights sweeping the road, every tree a potential observer, every shadow a possibility. The scratches on the hood stayed with me for weeks, a reminder of a night when the forest wasn't empty, when the dark had shape and intent, and I had no choice but to survive it. I arrived at the creek just as the first light of morning was brushing the treetops. The forest was dense and quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears and fills them with the sound of your own breathing. The air smelled damp, earthy, and faintly of decaying leaves. Mist hovered over the water in thin sheets, curling around the trunks of the pines and oaks lining the bank. I parked my truck on the narrow dirt path, careful not to make too much noise, and gathered my gear. My rod, tackle box, and cooler felt heavy in my hands, but I didn't notice the weight as I stepped onto the bank, my boots sinking slightly into the soft mud. The creek ran shallow at the edges, widening into deeper pools in the bends. I set up near one of these pools, casting my line into the glassy water and watching the ripples spread slowly outward. I had planned this trip for weeks, looking forward to being alone in a place where no one would intrude. I wanted to feel the rhythm of the forest, the way it moved without human influence. The first few casts produced nothing. The water was smooth, almost too still, and the fog hung low, obscuring the far bank. Gradually, the sunlight strengthened, lifting the mist in wavering waves, and I began catching fish. Small ones at first, then larger, the kind you could clean and cook over a fire. I worked methodically, paying attention to the current, the depth, and the shadows in the water. As I walked along the bank to find a better spot, I noticed marks on the trees. They looked like deep scratches, clawed and long, irregular patterns up the bark. At first, I thought deer might have rubbed their antlers, but the marks were far too high and jagged, inconsistent with anything I had seen before. I ran my hand along the rough wood, noting the splintered edges. They were fresh, the inner wood still pale and wet in the morning light. A shiver ran down my spine, but I brushed it off, telling myself it was probably a bear. Bears scratched trees too, and the forest had plenty of them. Fishing continued, but the day felt strange. Every time I caught a fish, it vanished before I could set it in my cooler. I had been using the same bait and technique, yet the fish seemed to disappear as soon as I landed them. At first, I thought I was imagining it, a trick of the light or my own clumsiness, but the pattern repeated over and over. I would reel in a trout or bass, lift it out of the water, and in a heartbeat it would be gone, leaving only the ripple where it had struggled. I tried adjusting my method, moving slightly upstream, changing bait, waiting longer, but nothing worked. The fish were there one moment and gone the next. By mid-morning, the forest had fully awakened. Birds called from hidden branches, insects droned softly in the underbrush, and the creek gurgled over stones and fallen limbs. I was tired but content, enjoying the solitude, until a sound upstream made me stop. At first, I thought it was another fisherman, but the splashing was irregular, too deliberate, too heavy for a human. It lacked the weight and crash of a deer moving through water, and it wasn't accompanied by the grunts or snorts you would expect from a bear. It was slow, almost careful, like someone or something testing the current with each step. I stayed still, scanning the foggy water, trying to locate the source. The ripples spread outward, wide and circular, and then there was nothing. I waited, my heart quickening, straining to hear anything else, but the forest had gone quiet again. I decided to pack up. The sense of unease had settled over me, heavy and persistent. I gathered my gear, carefully checking my line, my tackle box, and cooler. As I walked back along the bank, the marks on the trees seemed more pronounced, the deep scratches catching the sunlight in a way that made them almost glow. My boots left shallow impressions in the mud, and I noticed that the area where I had been fishing was eerily bare. No fish, no movement, as though everything had been pulled away. I returned to my truck and drove back slowly, looking into the treeline, half expecting to see something move. The day passed uneventfully after that, and I told myself the forest was just alive with animals I didn't recognize. A week later, I returned with 2 friends, eager to show them the spot. The air smelled the same, damp and earthy, the fog curling over the creek in the morning light. But when we arrived, the scene was completely different. My truck's usual parking spot was clear, the ground undisturbed. The creek looked the same, shallow and winding, yet all my gear was gone. The rod, tackle box, cooler, everything I had carried in by myself a week earlier had vanished. Mud that had been firm under my boots was now wet and churned, and in the middle of it, we saw a single footprint. It was enormous, far larger than a human foot, with deep impressions in the soft earth. Water dripped from it, leading back toward the creek, as if something had stepped out of the water and walked away. The pattern of the toes was irregular, the heel wide and flat, the arch slightly too long. We followed the trail briefly, but it disappeared into the woods. The scratches on the trees were still there, jagged and fresh-looking, as though they had been made yesterday. My friends tried to reason it out, bare, human, fallen trees, but nothing fit. The water dripping from the footprint suggested something had emerged from the creek itself. We spent hours searching, looking for any trace of my equipment, any sign of what had taken it, but there was nothing. The forest had reclaimed the area. Fish were scarce, the creek quiet except for its normal murmur over rocks. I walked along the bank, tracing the path I had taken a week before, noting the familiar bends and pools, but nothing else was there. The sense of being watched lingered, pressing against my skin and my thoughts. We left eventually, careful not to disturb the tracks, but the image of that footprint, dripping water and impossibly large, stayed with me. I returned to the forest several times after that, but never alone. The spot felt different now, charged with a silent caution I couldn't ignore. I didn't fish there again. I thought about the claw marks on the trees, the vanished fish, the weight and timing of the splashing in the water, and the footprint in the mud. The only explanation that made sense was that something had been living in or around the creek, something large and strong enough to take my gear without leaving traces except the footprint and the disturbed mud. It wasn't supernatural, just real, just something wild and hidden that I had stumbled upon. The forest stayed the same, dense and quiet, but I understood that the creek was claimed, and I was just a visitor. Even now, thinking back, I can picture the morning fog curling around the trees, the water smooth and still, and the sense that whatever had taken my gear was still there, somewhere beneath the surface, waiting, patient, and entirely unseen. The memory of the claw marks, the vanished fish, and that enormous footprint remains sharp, a reminder that the forest has its own rules, and sometimes it keeps its secrets.